Hello and a happy new year to all of you. Welcome to the first News Desk stream this year. I'm Biresh Banerjee.
And I'm Melissa Chan.
The U.S. attack on Venezuela and the capture of its leader Nicolas Maduro has some nations wondering if they could be in the firing line next. Why? Well, hear what the President of the United States has said so far about some of these countries.
Colombia is very sick, too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States. And he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you.
So there will be an operation by the U.S.
It sounds good to me. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
What is the line there for when the U.S. is going to get involved in those protests?
We'll take a look. We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
So a lot of threats, and we'll be talking about some of them later in the stream, especially the threat to take Greenland and potentially attack Iran. The root question, though, is, has the United States gone rogue? I mean, does international law matter at all in any of this? Or is there a separate set of rules for a superpower like the United States? Does the U.S. make its own rules? It's what we're discussing today on News Desk.
And helping us have that discussion will be U.S. foreign policy expert Brandon Bohrn from the Bertelsmann Stiftung think tank. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio.
Thank you.
There's going to be a lot to talk about, and later we'll be joined by another U.S. foreign policy expert, Rachel Tausendfreund from the German Council on Foreign Relations. And as always, we have someone looking out at your comments and chat. This week, it's Cheri Chan in the studio, so you'll be looking at the views and comments, bringing them into the discussion. And like always, she has a poll question to kick things off.
Yeah, it's today we are asking the question, who will be the U.S.'s next target? There are four options: Greenland, Cuba, Colombia, or Iran. I'm interested to see what all of you think, and I will announce the poll result later.
I mean, it's just worth mentioning that this is just the list that we came up with. Maybe there is a different list. We don't know, but this is what we think based on whatever we've looked at. These are the possible next target options.
Yeah, but if you have other ideas, please put that in chat.
And maybe if you don't think there are going to be any other incursions.
Anymore, yes, that's the other thing. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And while you're picking your choice, I just wanted to share a couple of comments that were posted on our YouTube community section from Middle Second, saying the U.S. has always behaved like the rules don't apply to it. From Michael Guerra, saying Trump wants to be a bigger aggressor than Putin. It's a competition to him. This is about ego and bragging rights. And then from Sam, saying China's multipolar world system is closer and closer by the day. So a smart group of people in chat. Keep those comments coming, keep those questions coming, because Brandon's sitting right next to me, and we will field those questions straight to him.
I mean, it's just interesting on the multipolar point of view. I mean, it's not just China that's talking about a multipolar thing. I don't even know if China is talking necessarily about a multipolar thing. I think it's more the global south, and China wants to be the head of the global south, and India talking about multipolarity. But that's something for another news desk. Let's start this particular stream. We are going to be talking about potentially a U.S. attack on Iran and potentially U.S. action to take Greenland that is under Denmark. But let's get started with Latin America. And why Latin America? Well, because of the actions over the weekend. You had the taking of the capture of Nicolas Maduro from the Venezuelan capital, Caracas. And when you had Donald Trump addressing the press from Mar-a-Lago, from his resort in Florida, he was talking about, for some people, it's a little-known principle of American foreign policy, but for people in the think tank circle, they're obviously aware of it. I'm talking about the Donroe Doctrine, but then you had Trump making a tweak to it. Let's just listen to what he had to say in that press conference.
All the way back, it dated to the Donroe Doctrines. And the Donroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Donroe Document. I don't know. It's Donroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. It was very important, but we forgot about it. We don't forget about it anymore. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, will never be questioned again. Won't happen.
So you had Monroe and now you have Donroe. Brandon, is this now U.S. foreign policy, or at least a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, the Donroe Doctrine?
I think after the actions of last weekend, it's relatively clear that the Western Hemisphere has become a clear focal point of this administration. It's reflected in the national security strategy that was released by the administration in December of last year. You saw the State Department shortly after the Maduro raid saying, this is our hemisphere. So, the Monroe Doctrine has evolved over time. I think it's taken on a life of its own to a certain extent under this administration. Initially, it was meant to keep European imperialists out of Latin America, where the United States considered it its sphere of influence. It evolved over time, and in the basically turn of the century, 19th to 20th century, to allow the United States to engage closer and intervene actually in Latin America, which of course we saw over the course of the 20th century, various examples of U.S. interventionism throughout Central and South America, in the Caribbean as well. But what we're seeing now is, to a certain extent, the United States reclaiming this sphere of influence, also looking to other adversarial actors like China, like Russia, who have interests, economic interests, military interests in these regions, to push those powers out of the region and keep it for the United States.
I find very interesting the phrasing, just one point that you used, the sphere of influence, because that is what it very much sounds like. The Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, although that wasn't the phrasing that was used by Donald Trump. But it sounds very similar to the thinking that we have seen coming out of Moscow under Vladimir Putin, right? This whole idea of spheres of influence. This is my backyard, you stay out of it, and I get to determine what sovereign nations there must do. So I am happy. It sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is Donald Trump thinking a bit like Vladimir Putin right now?
We'll take Stephen Miller's comments, for example, after the raid in Caracas. I mean, on the one hand, the raid itself was, I think, a testament, we were talking about this a little earlier, a testament to the professionalism of the U.S. military and clandestine services. I mean, an incredibly well-executed raid.
Whatever you think of the moral.
Exactly. But beyond that, the comments from Stephen Miller afterwards were, international niceties are all great. I think he means international law is fine and all. But we live in a world that is governed by power. It's governed by strength, and it's governed by force. Now, that trifecta of iron laws, as Stephen Miller put it, that is, to the question earlier from the audience, that is putting the United States in a completely different trajectory than what the United States has, propped up over the last 80 years, the rule-based international order that the United States helped to build and benefited from immensely in that time.
And I just want to share a couple of comments already coming in from Republic Unbowed, saying this shows that only one thing that matters is absolute power, which is kind of a paraphrase of what Miller said. Gummy Bear saying Trump is insane, where the F is Congress. So we've got that. And Biresh, I just wanted to say earlier that, Brandon and I, we grew up and the Monroe Doctrine in school was this ancient thing in the U.S. history books.
1823, right? That's when it was
just study it for U.S. history exams, and it's dead in the water. It just didn't really seem like it would make this comeback.
So why?
Weird and wild.
So why has it made this comeback? I mean, why is Latin America suddenly so important for the United States, Melissa? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or Brandon?
One thing I want to say is that this is a very unusual, and tell me what you think. This is a very unusual American administration in terms of the number of people who actually are familiar with Latin America. You have a ton of people from South Florida that went to the White House along with Trump. Usually, the Biden administration, the Obama administration had a lot of people from New England, from, elite universities and colleges, from other parts of the United States, from California, but not this contingent of people from Miami. And so whatever you think about the policies, my feeling also is there's more attention paid simply because these people know Venezuelans, know Cuban Americans, are Venezuelan or Cuban American in his administration, and collectively, and of course the most well-known one being Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But I think that's kind of like been my take on why this White House has paid so much attention to, frankly, a continent. If you talk to people in D.C. who are focused on Latin America, or even people in the government, these are the two continents that tend to get ignored, right? South America and Africa, right? Anyone with those two remits are always struggling to get to the White House's attention to do anything, and suddenly they're paying attention. So that's like, I think, just a thing of the Mar-a-Lago crowd, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I'm sure it goes further beyond that.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the national security strategy from December, it's really interesting to look at the sections on Latin America. And it talks about the position of the administration to want to enlist and expand its influence in the region. Enlisting by bringing in partners that have traditionally worked with the United States, and also expanding. Now, it doesn't talk about regime change when it's talking about expansion in this document. I think the events of last weekend are probably the clearest operationalizing of that key document. But it comes down to migration, which is something that the United States, this administration ran prominently on in both 2016, also 2020, of course, but 2024 in particular. Reducing the irregular flow of migration up through Central America into the United States, but also narco trafficking. This administration has labeled narco traffickers within Venezuela and Mexico as foreign terrorist organizations. It's the same classification that's used for organizations like ISIS, so keep that in the back of your mind. This is how the United States, or this administration, is viewing the threats from these regions. And of course, what you're hearing from the administration since the raid in Venezuela is it's the rare earths, it's oil, it's commodities that they do not want these countries to fall into the spheres of influence of Russia and China, and even Iran in the case of Venezuela.
I'm glad you mentioned the rare earths and oil, because I did want to come to that as a next point. It's almost like you're reading my mind. But while I have a question for you, it's probably just worth putting up some tweets from this account called the Trump War Room, which tweeted a few caricatures, cartoons, or memes, whatever you want to call them, of the new Donroe Doctrine with Donald Trump front and center. I'm assuming that the person on the left there is James Monroe, the president, I forget what number he was, of the United States, that first proposed the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. There you go. Maybe that's a take on the carrying a big stick approach with the Donroe Doctrine written on it. The question I had for you, Brandon, is after Nicolas Maduro was captured, Trump said that the United States would run Venezuela and that oil companies would go in. How much of the Donroe Doctrine for Latin America is to do with resource acquisition for what's being called the national security of the United States? Because one hears about the so-called lithium triangle involving Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. Rare earths in Brazil, 20% of the world's rare earths in Brazil. Oil in Latin America, the largest proven reserves of crude oil in the world. So it's too much of a coincidence to hear the president talking about oil companies going in and this resource-rich continent to the south of the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, if we take Venezuela, if we just isolate this case, as you said, Venezuela has the highest reserve of crude oil in the world. The United States has experienced a proliferation of light oil, of fracking, but there are refineries throughout the now Gulf of America, in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, that are they're set up to refine crude oil, which the United States doesn't produce at home, really. The United States is importing it mostly from Canada at the moment. So there is certainly an interest on the part of the United States, or on the part of this administration, I should say, to extract these resources. And we saw that, I think it was just today, that the new Venezuelan government under Delcy Rodriguez has said that up to 50 million barrels of oil are going to be going in the direction of the United States moving forward. So there are clear interests in oil, in rare earths across South America, and the idea that Russia and China are engaging in these regions, that's something that this administration simply doesn't want.
Yeah, but there's a difference in the way you engage, right? I mean, you can intervene and kidnap a leader, however disrespected or illegitimate that leader is, or you can cooperate financially the way the Chinese have been trying to do, not just in South America, but also in Africa, for instance. It just boggles the mind that in this day and age, you would have the United States, which has been for the largest part after the Second World War, the so-called the leader of the free world, the defender of freedom. Is it as simple as just going into a country because the leader is not there anymore and the oil is now mine? Is it as simple as that because we have bigger guns?
Well, I mean, we are in an era where might is right seems to be the leading idea of how foreign policy is conducted among actors around the world, and unfortunately, the United States is moving further and further in that region. I mean, what we saw. We're less than a week out of something unprecedented. The first time in history that the United States has forcibly, unilaterally, with its own military, removed a leader from power in South America. Of course, it was done over the course of the 20th century through various intermediaries and covert operations and so forth. But this is unprecedented. And I think that is the fear that many people have at the moment. We talked about these various countries that are we saw the segment a little earlier that are maybe feeling a little bit of heat from the administration. We've entered uncharted territory to a certain extent. Now, something I agree with you completely to your comments on ways in which to cooperate with countries. In the case of Venezuela, I think Venezuela also isn't a monolith. Now that Maduro is gone, just because you've removed the head of a regime, his number two is now the president of the country. Yeah. Has even introduced legislation that's cracking down in the country to root out individuals who could have possibly been involved in this raid that took place over the weekend. There are paramilitary units, there are narco-traffickers, there's the 8 million people who left Venezuela since Maduro came to power in 2013 who maybe would like to return. So when they look to the United States, this administration isn't talking about democracy. They're talking about look what we've gotten out of it. We've gotten the oil, and Trump has said very clearly that we're going to take it and we're going to distribute it accordingly. That screams of imperialism to the people of Venezuela, I would imagine.
There's a couple of comments and maybe one comment that is almost in the form of a question for you, so I'm going to share that. First of all, from DeVos, I do think much of this is noise and distracting from domestic things like Epstein, the White House reconstruction, etc. So that's one thought. From Nile, saying there is virtually no logic behind what the U.S. is doing. The goal should be to counter China, but rather the U.S. is bullying its neighbors. In Venezuela, it isn't even regime change since the same regime is still in power. Brendan, I'd love your thoughts on that, because there's also been some editorial stuff, Nile, about how this is a way to counter China. How much of that do you buy? And if you can explain that to people who don't quite understand how China fits into this whole Venezuela thing.
Absolutely. I mean, Venezuela is a country that has had long connections with China, Russia, and even Iran as well. With China, it's mainly an economic relationship. It's just a relationship of economic complementarity between the two, specifically, especially for oil. With Russia, it's more of a security relationship. But, in the case of China, China has had major interests throughout South America, throughout Central America, especially Brazil, with certain goods there. So, China has extreme interests in the region, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the United States under this administration is attempting to push Chinese influence out of those regions. Now, will it be successful? Is the Venezuela case, in the eyes of the administration, a successful one? Will countries fall in line? Will they get the message from Washington that, if you don't cooperate, if you don't go with the way that Washington wants things to go, you could be next? Will that have the intended effect? Or will it push countries in South America and Central America to maybe try to diversify and even increase their engagement with other actors around the world?
Just on the China question, it's interesting that it's come up. And hi, Nila and Divos, happy New Year to you guys. Thanks for being on the stream. The national security strategy that came out in December, it was talking a lot about the threat from Europe. It was talking about taking away certain nations away from Europe. It was also talking about unnamed threats. It did not name China or Russia specifically, which was very unlike for any U.S. security strategy. And I think back about the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration. Does anybody remember there was a president called Barack Obama? The pivot to Asia. So this thing of countering China in the Western Hemisphere, is countering China only limited to the Western Hemisphere and Asia is forgotten, the pivot is over? How do we read this?
Well, to a certain extent, you think about the tariff policy, the trade policy. The Obama administration tried to engage members within the Asia-Pacific region through TPP back in the day, this failed trade agreement that aimed to bring in these countries closer into the U.S. sphere of influence through increased trade and economics and so forth. The tariff regime that was introduced by the administration earlier last year, it essentially affects the exact opposite aim, where you're pushing these countries away. So there have been a lot of elements of U.S. foreign policy that in many ways contradict what the administration is saying it would like to achieve in regard to China.
That's an interesting point. I wanted to talk about the Latin American countries themselves. I mean, they are looking at this Donroe Doctrine, and they're obviously looking at this whole policy in a way of trying to extract resources for American national interest and security. What are they looking at? How do you read the response from the Latin American nations? It hasn't really been a united response to the raid in Venezuela, has it?
Not at all. I mean, no, each country has its own specific narratives and history and connections to the United States. Some countries in Latin America have been rewarded by this administration. You think of Argentina, you think of El Salvador, which has been one of the key countries in Central America in relation to the administration's deportation policies. Venezuela was actually cooperating a bit more with the United States throughout last year, releasing Americans from prisons in Venezuela, accepting deportation flights into the country. But other countries, of course, have been punished by this administration. You look to Nicaragua, with sanctions against its government, which politically aligns closely with Cuba and Venezuela. Cuba is the exact same. The president of Colombia, who will be leaving office in May, not running for re-election, Petro, he was placed under sanctions by the U.S. Treasury in September of last year, and Colombia was removed as a so-called drug control partner. So the reactions have been mixed, partly because all these countries have different relationships with this administration.
I think it's just a good time to just play for you guys what Trump has said about these various Latin American countries that Brandon there was talking about. We have a soundbite that is a compilation of what he's been saying. Let's just listen to that and then we'll continue the talk.
If Mexico wanted help with the cartels, we would be honored to go in and do it. Would I launch strikes in Mexico to stop drugs? It's okay with me. Whatever we have to do to stop drugs. Colombia has cocaine factories where they make cocaine. Would I knock out those factories? I would be proud to do it personally. I didn't say I'm doing it, but I would be proud to do it. I love the Colombian people. They're great people, energetic, smart, great. But their new leader is a troublemaker, and you better watch it.
Are you considering U.S. action in Cuba?
We're not. I think it's just going to fall. I don't think we need any action. It looks like it's going down. It's going down for the count. You ever watch a fight?
I have.
They go down for the count.
So a mention of Cuba there, mention of Colombia and Mexico, which leads me to the question of, are we going to see U.S. action in Latin America next?
I'm
talking about military action, obviously.
Military action, I see. Well, if you go back to the first Trump administration, there were actually reports that President Trump was interested in indeed striking with the U.S. military fentanyl production sites in Mexico at that time. Now, the first Trump administration has been a lot different from the second one, as you know. And at that time, he was kind of talked back from that decision. Who's to say? I mean, I think we are really in uncharted territory here, where we can't necessarily rule anything out. He's spoken, of course, also very positively about President Sheinbaum in Mexico. So the messaging is a little bit back and forth. I really can't say with any confidence whether I would rule that out or not. With regard to some of these other countries, let's say Cuba, for example, Cuba is economically very dependent on Venezuela. There were tens of thousands of barrels of oil being sent from Venezuela to Cuba every day. Now that supply has been stopped, the anticipation is that Cuba which is already in economic turmoil from the U.S. sanctions regimes, that it might fall on its own. So there are a lot of open questions about what the next U.S. steps will be. But I think something to consider taking a step back here is there's unfortunately this trend in American foreign policy where I'm not sure how it's still happening today, but you have the idea that we can take out a leader of a country, however corrupt, however terrible they may be, and peace and security and economic prosperity will ultimately follow. That is proven to be completely wrong. If you look at the actions of U.S. engagement over the last several decades. I mean, you spoke a little bit earlier about oil production in Venezuela. It's half of where it used to be in the 1990s. And the idea that Trump will simply get the U.S. private sector to invest in Venezuela, they're thinking about the lessons from Iraq back in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, where they're completely risk averse. They're not interested in investing tens of millions of dollars into a country where we don't even really know what the next steps are for that country. The first chapter's been written, but the most important pages lie ahead.
These are long-term investments, right? If you want to improve infrastructure. Did you have some comments that you wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a bunch of comments. So I want to share what AF Warrior is saying. I don't think there will be any other incursions, but it also wouldn't surprise me if there were. I do think President Trump is serious about pushing adversaries out of the Western Hemisphere. And then we also have DeVos saying all this imperial talk will only drive other countries to China and Russia. That certainly is a real possibility we've been talking about. So keep those comments coming and throw some questions our way as well.
Yeah, let's just expand the scope of this stream. We've been talking about Latin America and the Donroe Doctrine. Let's just expand it to certain other parts of the world. And here, specifically, I'm talking about Greenland and Iran. Let's talk about Greenland first. But before we do that, I'd like to welcome onto the stream Rachel Tausendfreund from the German Council on Foreign Relations. She joins us from the United States. She's an expert on U.S. foreign policy and transatlantic ties. Rachel, welcome to the stream. Thanks so much for making the time. You were talking about transatlantic ties. I mean, those ties are really under severe strain given the developments over Greenland over the past 24 hours. And this tweet, maybe we can just put it up on the screen, this tweet from Katie Miller, wife of Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Home Security Advisor, with that tweet saying soon. So Greenland really in a bit of a tizzy that, well, is this what's going to be facing military action? Before I come to you, Rachel, I'd just like to sort of play what Donald Trump had to say very recently over the weekend when it came to Greenland. Let's just have a listen for that first.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
I think it's a big communication.
You know what Denmark did recently to boost up security in Greenland? They added one more dog sled. It's true. They thought that was a great move.
Yeah, it's not as simple as adding more of a dog sled. It was more of an announcement of investment in Greenland. But, you know, there was a response of sorts from Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister. Let's just listen to that response, and then I'll come to you, Rachel.
I believe the US president should be taken seriously when he says that he wants Greenland. But I also want to make it clear that if the United States chooses to attack another NATO country militarily, then everything stops. That includes NATO and the security that has been provided since the end of the Second World War.
Wow, the end of NATO. Rachel, is the United States going to take military action to seize Greenland? Tell us.
I'm going to echo Brandon and say, yeah, you know, I would like to say it's completely impossible, but it's hard to say anything is impossible with this administration. I mean, the strange thing about this whole Greenland conversation is, you know, there's this idea, and the Donroe Doctrine is, you know, can be interpreted as a kind of sphere of influence worldview. Well, if that's the case, Denmark and Greenland, they already are in the U.S. sphere of influence, right? Denmark and by extension Greenland are part of NATO. So if we want to put more military assets around Greenland, around Denmark, we could do that tomorrow, right? This whole thing about the dog sled, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm sure Stephen Miller's wife doesn't really know the details of this. Frankly, I'm not sure Donald Trump is very deep in the details of, you know, NATO and all of these things. These are kind of like social media flippant conversations that unfortunately are getting then translated into, you know, real conversations. And not only did you have the post by Stephen Miller's wife, but you did then have Stephen Miller kind of make the case for that in subsequent interviews when he was asked about it. So, you know, there are lots of reasons that I don't expect any kind of military action against Greenland, but Donald Trump and Stephen Miller are in many ways running the show, and they're not necessarily very considered, careful, long-term or medium-term thinking actors.
Yeah, I mean, there have been lots of comments that we've been getting on this as well. You were pointing to a few, I think, earlier.
Yes, we do have a few comments that are interesting, and I'd love for you to also maybe expound on it. From Ayush saying, trust me, if the U.S. decides to invade Greenland, Europe won't do anything. And so the question to you is, will it? And then also from Scalpel, Europe is no longer a significant epicenter of global diplomacy. They are just a laughingstock. So qualitatively suggesting the same thing, that Europe won't do anything. And I guess the question that would go to you is what are the mechanisms within Europe's capabilities? Because I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to understand that Europe's military capabilities are not at the level as the United States.
Sure. I mean, in this case, you know, one has to sort of agree with Stephen Miller when he said very bluntly, although I think it was a mistake to say it like he did, you know, Europe would not be able to stop the U.S. if the U.S. wanted to do it. And that's militarily probably unquestionable, right? We saw what the special forces could do. And so on the one hand, yeah, there's not a lot of kind of short-term options for Europe. You also have the big problem or question of Ukraine, right? So you could imagine a scenario where there's some kind of deal that's being forced on the Europeans, you know, concede more of Greenland. But again, what about the Greenlanders? You know, like, let's just sort of ignore all of the legal questions that would be involved that I think actually are important, and actually are important also to the American people. But if we just put that aside for a second, sure, there's a world in which the U.S. could sort of pressure Europe on Ukraine on issues around security guarantees for Ukraine, continued support for Ukraine, and want some kind of concessions for, vis-a-vis Greenland in return. So that's also a scenario. There's a kind of scenario that involves persuasion campaign of the Greenlanders themselves. That's a more medium and long-term thing. And you have the kind of Russia Crimea possibility, where they just establish facts on the ground by flying in, you know, a few hundred more U.S. assets. There already are quite a few U.S. assets on Greenland. So there are lots of possibilities.
It's just worth pointing out that just yesterday you had 6 other European nations support Denmark and basically issue a statement. We can show up on the screen a copy of that statement in which the message was that Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. But Rachel, just help me understand, and I want to come to you after this, Brendan. Just help me understand, as you yourself correctly point out, that Denmark is a part of NATO. So if the United States wanted to increase military assets on Greenland, they could do that tomorrow. They already have a military base. I think it's Pitufik military base on Greenland. But but Denmark and the United States also have a treaty that was signed, was it 1951, that allows the United States to deploy military personnel and bases on Greenland. So all those possibilities are there, and I'm sure that the administration knows this. My question is, why do they keep talking about making it a part of the United States when the very security reasons that Donald Trump gives about Russian and Chinese ships being all over the place, when that can easily be done under the current security agreements that exist? Why make it a part of the U.S.?
Why, indeed. I think if you talk to anyone in the administration who sort of has been working on the security questions involved for any period of time in any depth, they would make the case that as long as, the European countries, Denmark and the Greenlanders are going along with the security assessments of what's necessary, and there are genuine security concerns, one has to say, but it should only be a problem for the United States if the European NATO members, and most specifically Denmark and the Greenlanders, somehow aren't going along with U.S. assessments or U.S. needs. So I see a real division here between the kind of security apparatus, including that in the Trump administration, and figures like Donald Trump and Stephen Miller, who, these are not national security scholars by any means, right? So they have a different understanding. It's not even very clear what Donald Trump's understanding is. It seems to be a kind of real estate, mineral understanding that he then justifies with security arguments that, however, as you rightly pointed out, don't necessitate Greenland becoming a state. And so it's sort of baffling. And you also have, one has to say, mixed messaging coming from the states. At the same moment that you have Stephen Miller talking about, why it makes sense to take Greenland, you have Marco Rubio reassuring European leaders who he's meeting with on Ukraine issues on the very same day, saying, don't worry about it. Military incursion in Greenland is not going to happen.
So, Brendan, we can discuss all we want, but a lot of what Rachel is saying it just articulates what the thinking here is. But no matter what we discuss and no matter what logic says, does it all boil down to what Donald Trump decides to do on a particular afternoon? Is it as simple as that?
Well, I think he has certain individuals in his immediate surround who are influencing him in one way or another. I don't think it's a coincidence, looking back to Latin America, the position that the United States took vis-a-vis Venezuela is taking vis-a-vis Cuba with Marco Rubio heading the State Department. So he is able to be influenced by individuals in his immediate surround. But of course, as we've seen with this administration, foreign policy is very much being dictated by one individual, and that is Donald Trump. It's very volatile. There, again, going back to the first administration, there aren't the establishment figures in the room who are able to, position him one way or another or talk him out of some of these extreme actions that have taken place over the last year. So it remains to be seen. But I also think, coming back to Greenland, I think there is a personal element to this. There's a legacy element to it. There are multiple examples of territorial expansion in the past by the United States. Also, Greenland in particular has been a country or a nation and a land that the United States has wanted to purchase in the past. At the same time that the United States purchased Alaska in the 1860s, there was a bid to purchase Greenland at that time from Denmark. Didn't happen. At the same time that the United States purchased the Danish West Indies, now the U.S. Virgin Islands, during the First World War, there were attempts to purchase Greenland at that time, actually using similar argumentation that the Danes were not able to properly defend these islands. So there have been elements in the past, also with Trump's first administration. He expressed interest at that time. So I think there's a certain element of this is where I'm the president who got Greenland for the United States. I could see that being a part of his calculus.
That's very interesting. I just want to share a few comments coming in. That guy, Potato, saying America won't take it by force. U.S. Will economically colonize Greenland like they did Hawaii or Europe to a lesser extent. That guy, Potatoes, saying that. I'm not quite sure how that would go, but very interesting thought. And another one from Sanjay saying what would actually happen if the U.S. tried to militarily occupy Greenland. I think we touched a little bit on that, but maybe if either of the guests want to say a little bit more. And then from Ayush saying, if Trump manages to annex Greenland, will it help him to win the midterms? I thought that was a very interesting question because we really haven't touched on the domestic thing. And I don't know if either Brandon or Rachel wants to answer that question.
Maybe Rachel wants to chime in on the domestic element of this. Is there a domestic domestic thing to his MAGA call that he's appealing to?
I mean, yes and no. So they've been hyping the kind of dramatic increase in support for military action against Venezuela subsequent to the very successful targeted extraction of the president. But even this dramatically increased number shows 37% support. That's a very low number. Especially knowing that we succeeded, right? But that's the kind of number you have when you're worried that you might not succeed. And so this is a very risky political operation for Donald Trump. This part was easy, right? And everyone is making the obvious comparisons to George W. Bush and his mission accomplished, press action in the Iraq War. And this is very similar because they've kept the military in place. They've kept the government in place. This is ensuring a certain kind of stability. But actually, Venezuela is already pretty destabilized. And in a way, the U.S. now owns the next few months or years of the instability and chaos of Venezuela. So I think this is very politically risky for Donald Trump. His supporters, his rabid supporters, are in favor of this kind of like muscular action. But no one's really in favor of any kind of messy consequences. And as Brandon pointed out earlier, these things tend to have messy consequences. So the domestic politics are, of course, important. And I don't think they're in any way very supportive of these kind of actions by Donald Trump. As I said, one kind of, successful bombing like we saw in Iran or this successful extraction, sure, that's fine. But as long as you can control the consequences, and who can control the consequences? Certainly not Donald Trump, and historically not the United States. So I do think this is risky, and Greenland would be, for many reasons, even more politically risky. I think it would be risky also among the military because they understand the consequences in terms of how important European cooperation is for U.S. strength. And we didn't talk about that, but I actually think that there would be military pushback if we were looking at some kind of attack against Greenland. And
I do want to talk about it. It's like I was telling this to Brandon earlier. He was reading my mind because the next thing I did want to talk about is military cooperation about NATO. And the reason I'm saying NATO is because Mette Frederiksen mentioned it. She talked about everything stopping, and NATO would be one of that. Does the U.S. president place any value at all on an alliance like NATO, or is it all the same to him? Whether it stays, whether it goes, it's irrelevant for him?
I think personally, Donald Trump thinks it doesn't matter. And in the end, Donald Trump does decide. That said, the military has enormous influence on what the president then decides in the end. And for the military to support this kind of targeted extraction like we saw in Venezuela is a very different story than supporting an action against alliance. So Donald Trump, I think, doesn't care that much about alliances. He doesn't understand the concept of alliances. He thinks the U.S. is a superpower and can be a superpower alone. Stephen Miller seems to also think that. But Marco Rubio understands that's not the case. the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Kane, and all of the military leadership understand that's not the case.
Brandon, you were nodding, and it's interesting that we're talking about this because Melissa and I were talking about this whole pushback from the military earlier in the day. Do you think there's going to be pushback from the military? I mean, can the military actually influence Donald Trump?
Well, I think there are certain individuals in Trump's surround who are probably able to talk him away from this decision. There have been some decisions over the last year that I've found pretty interesting. One thing was Greenland was initially a part of European Command, which is based in Stuttgart, Germany. In June of 2025, Greenland very quietly was actually moved out of European Command and is now part of Northern Command, which is based in Colorado. So Northern Command is now Greenland, Canada, and the continental United States.
That is very interesting.
Yeah. Of course, the byline at the very bottom, the fine reading is that the United States will continue to cooperate fully and wholeheartedly with Denmark and the people of Greenland. But there have been some interesting movements where you kind of start to question, well, what is the U.S. strategic thinking within the Department of War as it pertains to Greenland? But I think to Rachel's point, there are likely sufficient forces within Trump's surround who are likely able to advise the president on just the blowback, the destruction that would be the result of the U.S. annexation of Greenland. What I find interesting is Trump actually appointed a special envoy to Greenland. Correct, yeah. It's the Louisiana governor, Jeff Landry, and he actually came out with a statement on the same day as the European leaders released their own joint letter, basically saying that Greenland is Denmark's territory and was supporting the independence of Denmark. So there are a number of contradictions within Trump's surround, and I think the case of Venezuela is far, far different than what an annexation of Greenland would look like.
I just find it really stunning that both countries, Denmark and the United States, part of the NATO, assuming that there's some military-to-military cooperation, they talk to each other, but at the moment it would appear that nobody in Europe knows what the U.S. military's next move would be, whether it would move on Greenland. Do you find that strange, or is that to be expected?
Respectfully, for this administration, it's not strange. I think it kind of comes with the territory, but it's concerning, I think, from a alliance perspective that you would, especially within the NATO alliance, you'd want to have a sense of what the most powerful member of that alliance was thinking from a military perspective. It's just a sign of the times.
I was just seeing this comment from the only Nafister saying, Trump just acts scared of a real fight, so he's posturing, he's a bully. One opinion there. Let's expand the scope of this stream. Should we talk about Iran? Why Iran? Because, well, there have been protests in Iran for a couple of weeks now, and Donald Trump has commented about those protests. He's talked about intervening if the killing of protesters happens from the side of the Iranian regime. Let's just play a soundbite on what Donald Trump has said, and then we'll talk about that further.
There's been protesters killed in Iran. You said we were locked and loaded, ready to go. What is the line there for when the U.S. is going to get involved in those protests?
We'll take a look. We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
He's talking about getting hit very hard by the United States, Rachel, but there are already reports that at least 29 people have been killed in these protests. One can only assume that that's been from the side of the regime in some form, either the police or the civilian militia. Wouldn't that be crossing a red line based on what Donald Trump just said? And even if those reports are false, do you think Donald Trump is actually committed to attacking Iran again?
I don't think he's committed. And Donald Trump is lucky in that he can, give 10 different red lines and no one really knows what they are, and therefore he won't get punished for letting them be crossed. And this is one of the benefits of his sort of inconsistency and wild statements. I see no interest in this administration to sort of get deeply engaged in Iran and help any kind of pro-democracy movement in a significant way. At the same time, I think Trump feels pretty good about the success that they had in the previous bombing in coordination with Israel against the nuclear capacities. I can definitely consider, or I think it's definitely possible that they would do some kind of military asset strike in response to some, let's say, bigger, more dramatic pushback against these protests. But the next step that maybe other administrations would have taken in the past in terms of really getting engaged in supporting some kind of opposition, I don't see that happening. So I don't think we can rule out targeted bombing strikes or targeted strikes, but I don't think they're that likely. And I don't think that Donald Trump is watching this very closely, or even that it's a top priority of the administration. He just likes to talk tough.
I mean, just a word on the timing of these comments, because they come less than a month after this meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. And one of the points to emerge from that meeting was that if Iran were to ramp up its ballistic missile production, as has been reported in certain quarters, that would be grounds to attack it again. Is this what Israel wants? And is this something that America would be happy to oblige Israel for?
So far, Trump has allowed Benjamin Netanyahu, as we saw before in the attacks, to be more aggressive against Iran than the U.S. allowed in the past. I mean, it's also safer now because a lot of the capabilities of Iran have been sidelined. And so I think it is possible that Trump would sort of let Netanyahu do more strikes against Iran in response to some kind of buildup, and potentially do a very limited support of it. But Trump is going to be, I think, careful not to get too involved. At the same time, if it looks to be winning, he's going to want to have some little part of it so that he can call it a victory himself. It's a sort of win-win for him. If he lets Israel go ahead, he can take it as a victory if it succeeds. And if it fails, well, that's then a problem for Netanyahu.
Brandon, do you think Iran would be high up on his list of targets if Donald Trump has such a list?
A couple things. I think you talked a little bit about the timing of the comments. It's important to keep in mind that he's on a plane just within hours, days of this successful raid in Venezuela. I think he listed 5 or 6 countries that are essentially on watch, basically. So keep that. I think that's important for the viewers to keep in mind that you're on a high after experiencing what took place in Caracas over the weekend.
And he watched it, right? That's the thing.
Watched it from Mar-a-Lago in a makeshift...
Called it like a television show, right? That's what it is, it's like watching live television.
Yeah. And apparently there was also a Twitter feed on the side just to see what the reactions were on social media while this was taking place. So it kind of tells you a little bit about the optics of the that are so important to this president. I want to come back to the national security strategy because the Middle East sections are pretty interesting. Operation Midnight Thunder, which was this operation from June of last year that Rachel mentioned, the nuclear enrichment capacities that were, in the words of the president, obliterated. This was an example of the United States ending forever wars, that when you look to the Middle East sections, it actually verbatim, well, I won't say verbatim, it goes something along the lines of the Middle East will not be a center point of American foreign policy anymore. The Middle East will be a region in which the United States will be investing in oil and gas and critical minerals in key partnerships with the Gulf states. So the idea that the United States will engage in regime change in Tehran anytime soon, I see that as highly unlikely when you look to the Western Hemisphere and ambitions in that sphere of influence. I
do have to say it's really spooky because you do appear to be reading my mind, because I did have a question on the national security strategy because there was a part in there you talked about efforts to change governments in the Middle East. It called them a misguided experiment. So it just ties in with what you are saying. But to the other point that you made over there about Gulf states not supporting it, I mean, where do the Gulf states stand now, given that for the better part of 2 years, they've had a conflict raging in their backyard? There is some sort of a ceasefire now. Would the Gulf states support any U.S. strike against Iran if it were to happen? And would Trump even take these Gulf states into confidence, given that these Gulf states are spending billions of dollars on U.S. weaponry?
Well, what I would say is the connections between the Trump administration and the Gulf states over the past year has been, it's been somewhat unprecedented in terms of the levels of investment and the connections and the engagement of this administration with these actors. I can't say with certainty how the Gulf states would react. Obviously, this is not a monolith, and you have individual countries in that region that have different relationships with Iran. You think about Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran. Their reaction might be a little bit different from another country in the region, but it's a bit difficult to say.
Rachel, can you talk to us a bit about the Iranian side of things? I mean, in June last year, when these 3 nuclear sites were attacked that Trump claimed were obliterated, you had an Iranian response, albeit a smaller one. A military base was struck in Qatar, correct me if I'm wrong. If there were to be an attack from the Trump administration this time on Iraq, and again, we are speculating, if this were to happen, would Iran have to go all out and respond even more strongly than it did last year in June?
Before I get to that, I want to sort of underscore something Brandon said that's come up a lot in this conversation. I mean, we have to remember that Donald Trump is not like previous U.S. presidents. Normally, we're very used to kind of closely analyzing what the U.S. president says, taking it very seriously, because these are normally very considered remarks, right? The president thinks about what he, as it always has been the case, he says and what the policy is before he talks. And generally speaking, the administration is also very careful to stay kind of on message about things. And that's not the case with Donald Trump, right? He just says what he thinks in the moment. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't take anything he says seriously, but it does mean we should realize he's just sort of talking from his gut all the time. And so it doesn't mean that what he's saying reflects real plans or anything he thinks or feels very deeply about. I think that's really important because it's definitely different from how we normally analyze U.S. presidents and their comments. So to Iran, I mean, again, it's difficult to say. In the last interaction, you kind of saw the Iranian regime being a little more careful about escalation than the American regime, which is not normally what you would expect. And you saw a kind of cautious response out of Tehran. It's possible that would be the case again. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense for them. They are, facing a lot of challenges right now. They're quite embattled. And so they're already very vulnerable. Now, at the same time, you could say, okay, if they're feeling very vulnerable and attacked from inside and outside, then this would give them even more reason to react strongly. So I think it's really hard to say which way they would go, but certainly everyone involved should be cautious that they might not be as restrained this time, depending on the sort of depth and breadth of whatever attacks might come.
Can I pick up on one point you made, Rachel, and also what Brandon was saying about considered statements from the President of the United States? They've always been given their due weightage, and maybe over here it's a little different. But then the question is, if you're a country at the receiving end of one of these comments and certain threats are being made, which threat is a threat and which threat is not credible? How do you make that determination? What do you consider and what don't you? How does one do that?
So, I mean, it's very difficult, which means also, my job and Brandon's job these days is not an easy one. The best advice I can give, it's at least the advice sort of that I use, is when you really have to worry about something is when kind of what Trump's saying and Trump's instincts on something do overlap with the security concerns and apparatus. And in Venezuela, you have something like that, right? So Trump and his administration, they're not overly concerned with international law and these kinds of international niceties, as Stephen Miller called them, right? So they're willing to do things that might have been problematic for U.S. administrations in the past. And at the same time, you really do have a very strategically important country in the Western Hemisphere, close to the United States, that was in close cooperation with Iran and China and Russia, right? So you do have the kind of serious security analysts in and out of the administration who see Venezuela as a very big vulnerability in a context, let's say, of conflict with China in the near future. and you have kind of Trump's instincts about this, and they overlap. And that's why the strike in Venezuela makes sense. So, and where they don't overlap, and in my mind, military action against Greenland, for example, is where they don't overlap. I don't see the security apparatus being in line with Trump's thinking about that. Now, would I take that to the bank? I'm not sure, right? It's still Trump in the end. He still is the president. He doesn't have people in his administration, or frankly, so far in the Senate, who are willing to stand up to him. That's the big sort of exclamation point and question mark in all of this. But that's the best advice I have is, if something is consistent and if something is aligned with the security analysis and the Trump vibe, let's say, then that's what I would be extra concerned about.
It's a handy tip you're making over there, and it's a good thing that this is it's a stream, but it's also available as a video on demand. So your comments will stay on YouTube, and we'll see what it's like in the next few weeks. But Brendan, you had a point to make.
I agree with that, with Rachel's comments completely. The only thing that I would add is, in the midst of the volatility that the world is experiencing, I'm thinking about Europe in particular, where we're sitting at the moment. The response from the Europeans in regard to Greenland, the response from the Europeans in regard to Venezuela, that's been kind of mixed. Personally, I don't understand how you don't have 27 EU member states signing that letter immediately. But you see in Brussels, there's a little bit of slow to response. How do we carefully craft this message? And it just screams of the dependence that the Europeans have with regard to Washington. That, I think for the Europeans, this is yet again a wake-up call that the United States is an incredibly important ally of Europe that will likely remain the case for years to come. But the Europeans have some work to do here at home when it comes to engaging in its own security and defense and becoming more independent and becoming more strategically autonomous, if you will. That's a somewhat outdated phrase, but I think it still remains the case that if you look to this U.S. partner now, with a look to its comments regarding Greenland, with a look to how it's engaging on the world stage, the Europeans have to go their own way.
Let's try and look to wrap this up a bit. Rachel, do you want to give us some final comments and final thoughts on what we can expect in the next few weeks and months? Are we going to see more U.S. military action when it comes to, other countries or other leaders? Any more kidnappings that are going to be happening? What do you think?
I mean, I'm not sure about kidnappings. But, there was also the Christmas Day strike against ISIS in Nigeria just a few days before the action in Venezuela. I do think there's a kind of hubris at the moment because of the success of recent actions. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see more kind of targeted strikes and bombings, not necessarily kidnapping of presidents and extractions. But I do think Trump has the feeling right now that he is, as he said to The Atlantic, ruling the world and feels rather emboldened for targeted military actions, but discrete ones like we saw against ISIS. I would expect that. Further, it's just hard to know what to expect with this president.
You never know. Rachel Tausendfreund, thanks so much for joining us on the stream. German Counsel on Foreign Relations, U.S. foreign policy expert. Rachel, thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me.
Brendan, your final thoughts on what we can expect to see. Are we going to be talking about this again on another stream on News Desk very soon?
Well, like I said, I mean, I think my comments earlier were the first chapter is written and the most important pages of this book are still ahead. There are a lot of open questions, and we look to Venezuela. We're less than a week out from what's taken place there. There's incredible volatility. There's incredible volatility in the Western Hemisphere at the moment. You have several leaders that are shaking in their seats at the moment. It's a sign of the times, but I think their 2026 is gearing up to be a very interesting year when it comes to geopolitics.
And it's just the first week.
Yeah, well, Biresh, the poll, right?
The poll, right. And Cheri can sort of... You closed the poll, right?
I did, yeah. So here's the result, and I will just repeat the question. Who will be US's next target? We've got 516 votes 44% says it's Greenland, 23% says it's Cuba, 22% says Iran, and 11% says Colombia.
All right, so Greenland, a clear favorite even amongst the community. 44%.
That's what people pay attention
You're surprised,
to a lot.
Brandon. You're surprised.
I think it'll be very interesting if this does happen. I mean, you would think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the big wake-up call for Europe. Now, on the western flank, if something does happen in Greenland, I can't imagine anything. What else can awaken Europe from its sort of? It's done a lot, over the last few years, but not hardly enough. And
absolutely, I mean that we're in a situation now where people are asking, should Denmark be engaging in Article 4, where there are territorial, where there are fears of territorial dispute. Engagement from abroad within the alliance. It's incredible where we are at the moment. And Article 5, of course, it completely destroys this essential piece of the NATO alliance. And I tend to agree with the Danish Prime Minister in that it would be the end of this, honestly, history's most important military partnership.
What a thought. We'll end the stream there, I think, on that. I can't find anything more positive. I don't know what one can do. One can say positively.
Sometimes we're
something
here to
hopeful.
deliver the
It's
news, and
just,
sometimes the news is just
factual.
pretty hard.
Sunny here in Berlin today.
It's sunny. It's sunny in Berlin. Yeah, there you go.
Freezing,
Despite the Arctic blast.
Yes.
Brandon, thanks for being on.
Thank
Cheri,
you so
thanks
much.
for looking at the chat. Thanks to you guys for writing in the chat. We'll be back again next week.
And yeah, as always, we'll post the topic about 24 hours before the start of the stream. Check it out on YouTube under the community post.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.